Hello, this is John DeSalvo, and I want to welcome you to our fourth program in the Mysteries of the Universe series. And I'm one of the three co-hosts, and my other two co-hosts are Dr. J.J. Hurtak and Dr. Desiree Hurtak. So we thank you for listening in and coming back and watching our program on a regular basis. As I mentioned, this is the fourth program, and we're going to be continuing this series. And I want to give you a link before we start, because we're going to be talking about some pyramid research, a new chapter, some new information. Now, we talked a little bit about it in our last show, but the information we're going to talk about today is going to be new and more, and I think extremely interesting. But the website in which Dr. J.J. Hurtak is research director, and the Pyramid Association, which I founded many years ago, is gizapyramid.com, GIZAPYRAMID.com. I don't want to forget giving that out because it's a wealth of information, and you can also find more information about Dr. Hurtak. So, Dr. Hurtak, let me turn it over to you a little bit about where do you want to start in terms of the pyramids? Maybe, kind of wind up a little bit about the pyramids on Mars that you discovered, and talk a little bit about how you discovered the alignment in the Orion constellation, which I found extremely fascinating.
Well, we want to extend our greetings to our listeners throughout the world. It's a very important subject to realize. Not only do we have pyramids on our sister planet Mars in the Elysium Quad Triangle, but there appears to be a pyramidal grid system around our planet. Years ago, I did some consulting with Jet Propulsion Lab, and I had the opportunity also through my colleagues using what we call remote viewing. I also was involved with this, which is the use of the power of consciousness to see distant objects without technology. To simplify, I was able to see and identify strange pyramidal clusters on Mars before the Mariner 9 and Viking 1 and 2 probes were able to validate what I saw through the power of higher consciousness, which I describe in my book, The Keys of Enoch. At the same time, I was also able to realize through a higher state of consciousness that there was a corresponding grid system of pyramids around our planet. And in the Keys chapter 215, I'm showing this to the audience, you'll see a map of the planet, and across the center part of the planet, a series of what looks to be pyramidal locations along longitudinal lines going from north to south.
But what you may notice from that map is that the Great Pyramid is at the center, and that's always a question. Of course, today we use Greenwich Mean Time, which is just because the British were very powerful, when all of this started. But actually, we use the coordinates of the Great Pyramid as one of the central focuses for all these grid points around the planet.
So we'd like to talk about this pyramidal grid system because this basically lays a foundation for a re-examination of culture, history, anthropology, even theology, going back to a previous period of time when it appears at least 7,000 to 10,000 BC, various cultures had a similar mathematics and astrophysics of orientation, primarily to the system we call the Orion constellation, specifically the Belt of Orion.
Now, he saw this because this is not something from just scholarship, but really he had this unique experience in the 1970s where he saw the importance of Orion as a key function for our whole alignment with the heavenly realms, and we'll say with heavenly beings. But one of the things is not only did he understand that the star shaft points to Orion, and he put this in his book in the 1970s.
The South Star Shaft in the Great Pyramid.
From the King's Chamber. But also, if you now look to Mexico, and I know our discussion now is going to be on pyramids around the world in this unique grid system, it seems that even in the Yucatan, the Mayans, who really had a similar cosmology, because they also saw Orion as the father figure. And a young 14-year-old at the time, and then 15 by the time the news hit, working in Canada. His name is William Goddard, actually had done a coordination of the pyramids of the Yucatan with numerous star constellations, and he saw direct alignments. And one of the principal star configurations was also Orion. In fact, he says that, there's the three stars, Anotak, Anolam, and Mintaka. And then really the Mayans looked at Rigel and Safe. Those were the two lower parts. So they looked at the lower triangle. And he says that actually Safe is missing. He can point out Rigel, he can point out the other pyramids, and he can point out many of the other local constellations, but he's actually now said there must be a pyramid missing this. That's how specific the Mayans were. And
where would that be on our planet?
well, it's mostly, no, it's all the Yucatan, and it's crossing pretty much mostly in Mexico, but with a little bit, his pyramid structure that he created, probably a 14-year-old probably did not have the Keys of Enoch in hand. It's down here. It's right at the border. It's in Mexico.
Okay.
It will be at the border of Guatemala. And he looked at El Mirador. He looked at a lot of the other really special pyramids, and they all align with points in the heavens.
Were these lines that you showed any relationship to what we call ley lines? Any correspondence?
They work with ley lines. Obviously the French were the first to come up with a systematic use of longitudinal and latitudinal lines. Of course, the British amplified this, and this is pretty much the system we find in all atlases. But before that, there were what we call the paraphysical energies of ley lines, or areas of sacred energy that run throughout the world that most indigenous cultures identified by having mounds or small pyramids, or a relationship of stones like Stonehenge, markers that would indicate to people in the field or in the city that these were very important points. We would call them, in metaphysical language, acupuncture points of where the meridians of the earth converge. But getting back to our discussion, we want to point out that the breakthrough is now taking place, as we see on National Geographic specials, really are validating what we published in the Keys of Enoch in 1973, that our planet has a unique grid system that apparently ancient civilizations in the East, the Near East, and the Far West followed at a very early point of time. We find this on Lanzarote, of the islands, in the Grand Canarias of Africa. We find this in South Africa, in the mountains outside of Cape Town. We find this also in the jungles of Brazil, Mexico, Yucatan. So there's a whole mystery of how ancient physics, mathematics, and astronomy are converging now with a whole new interpretation of unification, of how we are part of a much greater history of unity.
Now, I have to say, in terms of ley lines, if I can just add, many of these relate much more to the heavenly constellations. And people wonder, why is the Great Pyramid at its place where it is positioned? Because of course it could be anywhere. Well, most people feel that if you look at all the land masses, north and south, east and west, that it's almost at the center of the land masses. But we've gone a little bit further. We've actually drawn coordinates, because if you take the Great Pyramid where it is, you go down, you actually find an area of like a stone circle, just like Stonehenge, although a bit smaller, called Nopta. And they supposedly also had alignments with Orion. You keep going further down and you find what we knew about for a long time, because we work with Credo Mutwa, a Zulu shaman, but Michael Tellinger has made it quite popular, and that's the Adams calendar. No, in the, well, actually it's Johannesburg area. And so this, also he's shown that there was, in these standing stones, connections also with Orion. So there seems to be not only grid points in a certain sense, but also alignment.
The reason I asked that, because that was one of my main research interests with the late Joe Parr, as you know, and many people who did pyramid research, and actually showed that the pyramid once a day points to the center of the galaxy. But what's interesting is in my study of the ley lines, there also seemed to be a higher radioactivity level at these ancient monuments that cross these ley lines. So I'm wondering, the other interesting thing is Joe Parr, and I bet almost none of our listeners know this, but Joe Parr is probably the only person to figure out how to measure and identify ley lines. And this is interesting, because when you showed me that diagram, I thought we could actually go there and scientifically test to see if ley lines are there. And this device was very simple. Joe Parr I called the modern day Tesla because he just could see things no one else did. He discovered that ley lines were like electromagnetic fields, like, to induce a current through a wire, you have to move it through a magnetic field. So ley lines were like that, which means you only could identify them if you're moving through them. So he mounted this like what it was, a giant coil, an induction coil, that's what I was looking for, with an audio amplifier and an oscilloscope, and would drive through the deserts and different areas at high speeds and pick up the changes in frequencies. And he was able to map out actual ley lines. I don't think anybody even knows about this or has tried it but Joe, and unfortunately, he died when we were actually getting to the nitty-gritty of this type of research. So it kind of excites me what you have discovered, because, and I look at a bigger picture, that what are ley lines? How do they affect our universe? You're finding correspondences with pyramids all over the world with grids. The ley lines seem to be moving through these monuments. There's a higher radioactivity level. Something's going on. What do you think the overall picture is? What's the whole purpose of this grid, these ley lines and these monument alignments? Why is it just by coincidence? I don't think so.
They're pointing to a common blueprint of evolution, that the human creation has been divided down through the centuries. We are told in the ancient scriptures, the book of Genesis, that there was one language. And we feel that parent language was a language of consciousness cosmology. Some would call it the language of a higher connection between the esoteric and the exoteric, the inner and the outer evaluation of life, that the ancients would look at the stars, they would look at the seasons of planting the food, they would look at the variations of the Nile that would provide flooding and agricultural possibilities to the peoples of the Near East. All of these factors that were sort of dampened through classical history have now appeared to us from all directions. And again, we want to point out that we've done the actual work in Africa, beneath the sands of Egypt, even beneath the ocean off of Yonaguni and Okinawa in the Far East, actually measuring what we see in this blueprint from the Keys of Enoch.
And I was going to say, another person that I think did a very good job, and it was almost a little bit after the Keys of Enoch, was Bruce Cathy. He also did a harmonic of the Earth. And there are, I mean, the whole sphere itself is really a magnetic, ball. And we can see where there's a weakening magnetic fields and a strengthening of certain fields. And Dr. Hurtak actually sees the planet, and this is part of the Keys of Enoch, in what as a special grid structure. So he has two. He has the artificial ones, which are like for this particular time zone. And then also you can see the structure of the actual Earth in certain positions and places. And Beth Haggins has actually taken this map and drawn additional lines. In fact, one of my goals has always been, and maybe someone wants to help us with an app, to create a app where people can draw their own grid points, their own alignments for where they live. There's special grids everywhere on the planet. I mean, it's amazing. Even here in New York, they're a little bit further north of here, you can actually find these caves that have been used, we'll say hundreds and hundreds of years ago, that are also in kind of magnetic lines.
And
okay,
also,
a quick question. If you're in this grid area, in this ley line area, do you find people have an increase in psychic ability and paranormal events? And also, who's responsible for the original blueprints? Are we talking about an alien culture? I may be jumping ahead, but I'm kind of looking at what's the significance for man in our future because of your discoveries.
We work with two Russians named Kashashev and Trofimov, and they did research on what the effects of magnetic fields are, and that's what we're kind of talking about, because that's how Joe Park could pick it up, on the planet. Of course, I grew up in Florida, and there's supposedly this kind of vortex there off the coast of Florida, the Bermuda Triangle. There's also another one by Japan. But in actuality, they found that when there's a weakening of the magnetic field strength, which, by the way, the planet is going through now. We've dropped since about 1890 about 15% of the strength of the field, and they can tell this from pottery. But with that said, there's a great weakening of the magnetic field that's going over now from South Africa, but mainly over Brazil. It reaches all the way to Chile. It's called the South Atlantic Anomaly. And you know, if you have to go around the planet and say, where are people very spiritual or very even psychic, we wouldn't even call it spiritual at this point, just psychic, and you say these Brazilian people are amazing. And India also, all the southern part of the globe is now experiencing somewhat of a weakening-er.
Well, what's causing that? Is it something man is doing?
No, they think it's something that has to do with a connection between the mantle and the outer core around the area of South Africa. So anyone can look up and we can talk more about this because we feel it affects a lot of things. But actually, we believe that it is all part of the whole cycle that the planet is going through. And you know, about every 400,000 years, what's in the north, if you look at a compass, would be north, and what's in the south would be south. Every 400,000 years, it simply switches, and it doesn't simply, of course, no one really knows because it's 400,000 years ago. Well, actually, it's more than that because we are long overdue. It's 780,000 years ago since the last magnetic flip. So we could be very close to that point at this time. We don't know. And scientists from University California, Santa Cruz, and others are looking at the possibilities.
So if you put together the science with the mythology at certain intervals of these cycles of cataclysmic change, or what I will call cataclysmic geology, the understanding of change throughout the world, through all the myths of the rising of the ocean, the flood stories, we see the intervention of other forces, other cosmic forces. So I would not call them simply extraterrestrials, but the cosmic others, whether they are extraterrestrials or ultra-terrestrials or extracelestials. These are various mythical, psychological terms for other evolutionary intelligence that's making use of the grid system to help the human race.
But one other thing that's very important, what we're talking about, Dr. Hurtak calls the pyramid, especially the Great Pyramid, a chronomonitor. And if you tie that in with your associate in Russia, Professor Golog, he will tell you that these pyramids are sending out energy, are affecting the magnetic fields, affecting the whole field of the planet everywhere they exist.
And if you live in
oh, you know what? Let me comment on that because of my work with Galit. Exactly, when he was building the large 140-foot pyramid in Moscow, all of a sudden the military radar picked up large energy fields coming off his pyramids, and they were going, well, it was like a mile high, and they sent out the Russian bombers to see what was going on, and they found out it was this large energy field over the Galit's pyramids, but this is very interesting because Joe Parr found out, remember you mentioned the kind of monitor, but the interesting thing is Joe discovered, as I mentioned in our last episode, a energy field that surrounds an experimental pyramid. All pyramids tend to have this light, small energy field. It was really intensified when the neutrino increases, and the neutrinos are what could wipe out civilization. So is the pyramid and these grids somehow a fail-safe mechanism to increase their energy field around the Earth to prevent us from a neutrino bombardment? And I'm sorry, I meant the neutrinos are coming from the center of the galaxy. And that is, are these grid systems, are these pyramids, are these some kind of fail-safe mechanism to prevent the world from being destroyed? You know, millions of years ago, because of a burst of gamma rays or whatever, there was a mass extinction of many animal species. So what Joe Parr discovered in his lab, that if he spins a pyramid in a magnetic field, an energy or orb, a bubble would form around the pyramid, and it would isolate it, and nothing could penetrate the pyramid. No gamma rays, no neutrinos, no radio waves. It was like a perfect shield, which I don't think there's one like that in existence today. I mean, just think of the military applications, which I hate to say. But so Joe found out that this energy field around the pyramid, it's like a bubble protecting the pyramid. So nothing can get in or out. No electromagnetic radiation, nothing. But at certain times of the year, it was intensified and even closed off completely. And other times, it was more permeable. And he found out over a 10-year period of mapping the neutrino and the gamma rays coming from the center of the galaxy. We don't know what causes them. There may be a black hole or two black holes circulating each other, but NASA discovered them. And Joe was keeping a record of the energy field around the pyramid. And 10 years later, he obtained the NASA data, and it matched exactly his observations, that when the gamma rays increased from the center of the universe, which would be detrimental to life, the bubble around the pyramid increased tremendously, like protecting the Earth. And then tying in with your Orion, at certain times of the year, the sun was lined up with the Earth and Orion, and there was a neutrino field from the sun to the Earth. And when that happened, the pyramid would fly off the base of the centrifuge and become embedded in the wall, almost like going through another dimension. It was like embedded in the wall, exactly lined up. So the thought is two possibilities. One is the pyramids were built by some advanced technology to produce an energy field to protect the Earth in the case of another possible extinction of gamma rays from the center of the universe. And the pyramid's base once a day points exactly to the center of the galaxy. Joe calculated that. So you said it before that, remember, the pyramids could be monitors. Everything you're saying ties in. And so was the pyramids built for protection and maybe a conduit, a transporting device from the Earth to someplace in Orion or beyond? I mean, it's speculation, but the data is amazing. And what you talk about and what Joe talks about, I mean, it kind of fits together. So that's what we were working on, and we were developing sorts of ways of testing it. But when we talk about the pyramid bubble closing off, it closed off completely. Nothing could pass through it. Not radioactivity, not electromagnetic radiation, neutrinos. Nothing has that type of protective coating. So what is it? We don't know. By the way, but in his experiments, he did this so many times, he created a bubble around his whole house, like an artifact, which you couldn't get rid of. And bees that flew into that bubble wound up in his closed lab, dead, like colonies collapse syndrome. So we're wondering if all this could have some major tie-in. So
let me say this. The pyramid is the most perfect geometric form to survive cataclysmic change or earthquake. It's a form used by all major cultures down through history. It has obviously astrophysical applications, sociological applications, and we found within the pyramid musical, vibratory applications to the whole life force. And so it's a multiple generator system that's very important. We've done the mathematics as well as very significant studies inside the pyramids, both in Egypt and in Mexico.
And now you're pointing out geophysical applications. And I would contend that it's not just the Great Pyramid, because we've traveled around the world. You have the pyramids in Mexico and the Yucatan. In fact, they found recently, and we can get into this in another program, about 10 million people actually lived around these pyramids from, we'll say, the northern part of the Yucatan down to Patan in Guatemala. And of course, there were some cataclysmic problems with water. That's something that is a different thing to solve. And that's why we went from the classic to the post-classic Mayan era. So it wasn't just the Spaniards that killed off the Mayans. It was really environment. But I love the fact that you're saying that they really are protective areas. I think people psychologically, intuitively know that, and they flock nowadays to the pyramids because we do feel that they're key energy vortex points that have been placed at certain areas of the planet. We feel there's at least 12. We would even say 24 because we add another set of them. Like the Bosnia pyramid, for example, we've been there. It's a question, and there's no proof. I can't say 100% it's proven, but we can say that it probably is, and it might have been really for another cycle of time in the past, not in the last 6,000 years. The Great Pyramid is for our cycle of time now, and the ones in Mexico are for our cycle of time.
Oh, by the way, you mentioned audio sound. The other interesting thing, a correlation, is that Joe found that the slope of the pyramids, and I mentioned this before, of 51 point whatever degrees.
150, yeah.
You know, if you produce sound, audio sound at 52 hertz or 52 cycles per second, it'll increase that bubble. So, I mean, that's really a heck of a coincidence. By the way, there was a Star Trek episode about this also, if you remember. A pyramid on a planet, and they landed, and the pyramid was supposed to deflect any asteroids, and it was broken. So it was very interesting.
Well, John, the famous television writer Gene Roddenberry worked with one of our study groups in New York back in the 70s.
Wow.
So he was aware of our research indirectly. And I mentioned this in one of the programs I did on the life of Andrei Puharich, who was a known paraphysical investigator who had ties with the U.S. Army and was very much interested in the range of sensitivity and how the pyramid can amplify or dampen certain situations of mind, body, spirit relationships. And anyway, I want to emphasize the Keys of Enoch were the first to show the relationship between the Great Pyramid and the Belt of Orion. Specifically,
good. I wanted to cover this. Yes.
Arabic, the three names that are in the Keys of Enoch. We know them in the Greek names. We know them in mathematical relationships. But it appears that the pyramids in the orientation to Orion is a type of calendar system that shows us the cycles we must go through. The Great Pyramid points to Orion, well over 1,400 light years away, but also the insignificant parts of the smaller stars that are not normally recognized by the cultural mythologist. So what we're saying is we must see the integration of historic knowledge with present scientific measurement, musical measurement to raise our consciousness and prepare ourselves to go beyond cataclysmic change, to realize that these pyramids are stepping stones to the greater universe, the story of the divine, or what the Bible calls in the original Hebrew, the B'nai, or the sons of light, who periodically revisit our planet when we go through all of these psychological, sociological, and geological changes.
And just to talk a little bit about the pyramids around the world before we close, you know, Peru has pyramids. It doesn't just have Machu Picchu with temples. It actually has pyramids that we visited ourselves, like Pachacamac. And also, of course, next to, most people don't know this, Tiahuanaco is this Punapuchu, which is another set of pyramidal sites. So there's many other places around the world, and even in Japan, there's actually a pyramid mountain very similar to what you find in Bosnia. But Dr. Hurtak has also looked extensively at the Indonesian pyramids, and like the one is known as Sukuk. In the, it's really a 15th century pyramid, but a lot of the pyramids in Indonesia and in the Southeast Asian area seems to be, we'll say, a more contemporary pyramid that was built over more ancient sites. And you find that also in the Yucatan. If you go to Tikal, you find 3 layers of construction.
Sure.
I just want to say, for our Chinese listeners, I also want to mention the Seon pyramid in China, and that actually was considered built before the time of Christ.
Yeah, so what Desiree has just illustrated is our research throughout different parts of the world, showing us this ring of pyramids, a grid system to be sure, that points to a common base of knowledge that can link humanity together and rediscovering a common past, a basic mathematics and astrophysics that our ancestors used for communication with the star people, the star nations, who are now returning, and according to the Keys of Enoch, to the scene of the human experiment. So we will anticipate, we believe, in this coming decade, more and more evidence that is suggesting that the cosmic others from key installations, such as the Orion area or the Orion constellation, will be returning to the scene of the evolutionary change.
And the Pleiades is another constellation recognized by the ancient Aztec as well as the Mayan. And of course, there's many, many more. The Sirius. But I want to say also, just because we want to go around the world, that there's the sacred temples in India. We believe that's considered what's called the mountain peak. It's the Sinkhara type of structure, this is the tall pyramids, is also really a pyramidal construction that points to the heavens, that probably creates the same amount of energy. And that's what Golan in Russia has shown, that you don't have to have the 51-51 alignment or 51-50 alignment. You can have also very tall pyramids, which he's done, and they produce the same amount of energy.
Yeah, I was going to say that because that was my work with him. I was the spokesperson for a decade, actually 10 years, for Alexander Golan, who was at that time director of a Russian state defense enterprise, who actually financed the building of those pyramids. Their slope was around 73 degrees or so. People ask me, I think I'm the only one besides him that knows the exact dimensions. But the interesting thing is that we're saying the same thing too, that these pyramids were built for our benefits. And Golan has shown, and I'd like to do a whole show on this sometimes, that extinct flowers started to grow around the pyramids, the ozone layers were being repaired. In fact, he had quartz crystals placed in his pyramids and then brought into the Mir space station, at that time when it was operational. I was supposed to get one of those crystals, but the cosmonaut gave them all away by the time they got to me. So I was so mad about that. But
to recapitulate for our audience, we're now at an amazing time of understanding the other aspects of pyramidal knowledge and why they're so significant, all of the cultural histories of our planet. We're now beginning to recognize that just as NASA has used, as it were, a type of foam template made of pyramidal forms for the use of sound techniques or the dampening of sound. Also, the pyramid is a construct that is used in all aspects of geometry for evolutionary enhancement. We are at a time that we must understand why the keys of Enoch have been given, along with other research that you and Desiree has mentioned, to give us a blueprint of change that is quickly coming. And so we ask that the higher intelligence that has brought us together quicken us, bless us, and make us aware that we are the capstone that's missing on the Great Pyramid. We are the higher philosophy, psychology, and consciousness that puts all of this together and redistributes it worldwide, with the Great Pyramid of Giza to be, in more recent evolutionary time, the key foundation stone for our new evolutionary history.
Well, I like that. I've never really heard it summed up quite so eloquently. And it really, you know, today with all the strife and wars and fighting and disasters, when I listen to what you and Desiree are saying, it kind of gives me hope. It makes me feel real excited about being in this area like you guys are, researching this and making these discoveries that could change the course of our future. And okay, I want to also, before we sign off, mention for further information, you could go to our pyramid website, the Great Pyramid of Giza Research Association, gizapyramid.com, and Dr. Hurtak is research director of that. And could you give out your websites and also how to obtain your book, The Keys of Enoch?
Right, keysofenoch.org, as well as for our articles, futurescience.org. Join us at both sites.
Great, thank you. And I have to say, one of the most significant and spiritual transformation books I've ever read in my life. I guess, too, maybe to end the show, I want to, again, thank you for your wonderful teaching. Your book.
We hold up the pyramid diagram at the beginning of the Keys of Enoch to show the multicolored capstone that we represent with all peoples and all cultures, that connects the ancient scriptures with the ancient science, with the modern scriptures of consciousness development and the science of the stars. May we be blessed as we go into our future.
Yeah, and I want to thank the audience, people who tuned in, and I hope you continue to watch the series, because I don't know about you, but I'm really enjoying it, and I'm learning a lot, and I think this is unique. You're not going to get information like this elsewhere, and as you can see, it's not just for entertainment. We are here for a purpose. We're serving humanity. We're serving the universe, and there's no better illustration than that than the last 40 years of research of Dr. J.J. Hurtak and his wife. Maybe not 40 years. We don't want to, push that.
Yeah,
right?
You don't want to date us. Yes. Thank you.
But
it's about 40 years. Yes.
Well, I mean, I thank you for your contribution and thank the audience. And please stay tuned for further programs. And we send our blessings and peace to all of you. And good night or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.